feel that Pauline Hanson has played the government over the union busting bill?
Well, I went through several weeks of negotiation with Pauline Hanson, Malcolm Roberts and One Nation. The last words that Malcolm Roberts said in the Senate was that it's now time for integrity in the union movement, which is what hard-working Australians expect. Ultimately, the vote of Malcolm Roberts and Pauline Hanson didn't reflect that stated sentiment. Some of the matters that were raised by Pauline Hanson as reasons that she didn't support the legislation were never raised with me in weeks of negotiation. But look, ultimately, at the end of the day, this legislation will come back and One Nation will again have to decide, do you take the side of hard-working Australians who want to turn up to construction sites, whether they're apprentices or whether they're tradies, and just do their job without being harassed, spat at, intimidated by thugs from the CFMMEU. The ultimate decision here is, do you take the side of the hard-working Australians who want to be able to turn up to work without being intimidated by the CFMMEU thugs, or do you take the side of the thugs? Now, very sadly, at the end of the day, after weeks of negotiation, One Nation sided with the thugs. It's a very disappointing result, but it won't stop us from trying to protect Australians who work on construction sites from thuggery, from violence, from intimidation. They deserve the protection of the law, and that's what we will seek to deliver to them.
Has it damaged your trust in...
Well, I considered that the process was to be conducted in good faith, but I think ultimately that was an error in judgment.
Has she given any reasons as to why?
Well, I'm not going to go into each and every one of the multiple private briefings and conversations that we had, but we very much had the expectation that the bill would be supported. And ultimately, the bill deserves parliamentary support. The bill sets a reasonable standard around when it would be that cumulative, serious law-breaking by individuals and by unions would warrant the ability of the courts to disqualify a union official or deregister a union. And indeed, Pauline Hanson and One Nation proposed multiple, I think 11 different amendments that we negotiated with them, all of them with which we accepted. And it does raise the really interesting question, why would you propose 11 amendments to a bill, ensure that the entirety of the week in the Senate was devoted to debating the very amendments that you, One Nation, put up, and then ultimately to have them all accepted and not support the bill? I mean, I've actually not seen anything like it. It is exceedingly strange, but as to why it was that process was followed by One Nation, you have to ask One Nation. And it may be that, you know, at the end of the day, they reach some agreement with the CFMEU, but that's a question that you'll have to ask One Nation.
So have they given any form of reason as to why they changed their mind?
Well, you've seen the media release that was put out by Pauline Hanson. It said that there were concerns about the fact that administrators would be brought in to look after an organisation that had become dysfunctional. I had weeks of negotiation with One Nation. The issue of administrators being brought into dysfunctional organisations was never raised, not once. So whether or not that's something that's occurred as an explanation after the event, I can't say. But ultimately, we as a government negotiated in good faith with Centre Alliance, with One Nation. One Nation supported all of the government's amendments. The government supported all of One Nation's amendments. It does raise the very interesting question, why bother go through that process, which is hours, days of Senate time, and then not support the bill at the 11th hour. And ultimately, this bill will come back into the Parliament. I will bring it back in the form that it ended up in the Senate to my party room next week, and we will pursue it again. Because hard-working Australians, whether they're contractors or subcontractors or tradies, they have a right at law to decide whether they want to join a union or whether they don't want to join a union. And if they don't want to join the CFMEU, they shouldn't be harassed, menaced, spat on. We should not have union officials who have assaulted individuals, who have assaulted police, still able to hold the office of a union official. No Australian, I think, considers that that is appropriate, and to protect Australians who work on work sites in construction, this is very necessary legislation.
Has this damaged your view and trust of One Nation?
Well, I mean, look, you go through negotiating processes, and over the last 10 years, if there's one lesson to be learnt about serious reform that needs to pass through the Senate, when you don't control the numbers in the Senate and there's a crossbench that require negotiation with, you negotiate And very often it takes 2 or 3 attempts, and legislation is brought back 2 or 3 times before it ultimately succeeds. And we won't be giving up on this legislation, because we have chosen the side of the hard-working Australians who just want to turn up to work on construction sites in South Australia and Victoria and Queensland and go about their business without being menaced and harassed and spat on and called dogs and scabs by members of a union who are trying to bully them into joining. It's totally unacceptable, but it's gone on for far too long. $16 million worth of court fines, 2,160 offences, instances of breaking workplace laws. Workplace laws are being broken by the CFMMEU to the tune of 2 or 3 times a week. The courts have been crying out for something to be done. This legislation ensures appropriate, reasonable standards, and we'll be bringing it back.
Do you now trust Pauline Hanson when it comes to other legislation?
Well, it's not a question of trust. What we want to do is secure support for the bill. And the bill, I think, has enormous merit to it because it protects Australians on workplaces around Australia. In Queensland, where Pauline Hanson is from, the Queensland Public Sector Union has told its members, who are safety and health inspectors, not to turn up to CFMEU control work sites because they're too afraid to. The CFMEU's bullying and intimidation has meant that public sector health and safety inspectors aren't turning up to work sites. And that is totally untenable, surely. So this is very, very necessary, very important legislation. It's not going away, it's going to come back, and that will offer an opportunity for Pauline Hanson, for Malcolm Roberts and for Jackie Lambie to reassess their position. Keeping in mind, of course, that Jackie Lambie on multiple occasions said this: if John Setka is still in charge of the Victorian division of the CFMEU, she would support the legislation. Well, I'll tell you what, John Setka is still in charge of the Victorian division of the CFMEU, and John Setka is a prime example of an individual who does not deserve to have the privileges and public status and rights that an official of a registered organisation has. He is the type of person who is not fit to hold the office of a union official. That seemed to be Jackie Lambie's view for months. In fact, she was the subject of intimidation by John Setka himself, which is why she said she would vote for the bill. And ultimately, she didn't vote for the bill and she wasn't good to her public statements. But it's One Nation, it's Jackie Lambie who've got questions to answer about why it is that they took the decision that they took. Okay, one more. Sorry. Look, Jackie Lambie's amendments were totally unworkable. They were dropped into the Senate right at the last minute, which says to me that they weren't a serious effort to secure changes to the legislation. I will bring the bill back to the party room in a form that reflects all of the government amendments, which One Nation agreed to, and reflects all of the One Nation amendments, which the government agreed to. A bill in that form will come back to the party room. And that'll be the bill that is brought back into Parliament, into the House of Representatives. But ultimately, if Jackie Lambie or Pauline Hanson want to offer further practical suggestions, we'll do what we did during this recent process, which is listen to them and talk to them and reach agreements. And one thing that the government will always be is good to its agreements. Okay, thank you. Sure.
Christian Porter there laying down the law. We just might have a quick listen and see if he's adding something here.
The proposed changes to the draft model laws that Mark Speakman, as New South Wales Attorney General, will release in the coming days for public consultation, deal with every issue other than the status of digital platforms. So all of the other issues have been agreed and will be the subject of the material that will be put public soon. The issue of digital platforms is the one thing that will be moved on to a second round of consultation and reform. That is because there are obvious complexities around that. But that reform, again, isn't going away, but that is the one thing that has been deferred. I think 18 other matters are being dealt with in the model reforms that will be released in the next couple of days. Okay, thanks everyone.